The American economic system is under broad attack from perfectly respectable elements of society, from the college campus, the pulpit, the media, the intellectual and literary journals. Listen to the gravity in those words. That was written by Lewis F. Powell Jr. back in 1971. And you can just feel the profound sense of alarm, right? It paints a picture of an absolute existential crisis, this overwhelming feeling that the very foundations of the free enterprise system were literally crumbling. And as we're going to see, this deep-seated fear set the stage for one of the most massive institutional realignments in modern American history. Welcome to this explainer. Today, we are unpacking the 1971 Powell Memorandum. Now, depending on your background, you might have some pretty strong feelings about corporate influence in America. Or, hey, maybe you've never even heard of this memo. And honestly, that's exactly why we're here. We are going to gently peel back the layers of what is arguably one of the most consequential, yet least known documents in American political economy. We'll be looking at it objectively, exploring it as a historical turning point that fundamentally shaped the world we are all living in today. So here is our roadmap for today. First, we'll look at the 1970s business crisis. Second, Powell's strategic blueprint. Third, the corporate mobilization. Fourth, reshaping the courts. And fifth, we'll ask, was this a blueprint or a structural shift?
Let's jump right into part one, the 1970s business crisis, a true crisis of confidence.
To really understand this memo, we have to step into the shoes of American business leaders in the late 1960s and early 1970s. The traditional post-war consensus, which was a time of relative labor peace and pretty moderate regulation, well, it felt like it was totally collapsing under a global revolutionary tide. In 1965, activist Ralph Nader published his famous exposé Unsafe at Any Speed, which targeted General Motors and essentially birthed the modern consumer movement. And then by 1970, even under the conservative Nixon administration, we see the creation of the EPA, followed swiftly by OSHA in 1971. To industry executives, this rapid shift felt like a massive regulatory binge. They were suddenly facing this unprecedented onslaught of demands for corporate accountability, environmental protection, and consumer safety. So, business leaders of that era felt incredibly vulnerable. The source texts actually describe them using words like impotent and despised. Can you imagine that? The most powerful executives in the country saw themselves as the new forgotten man in Washington, D.C. They were watching public interest groups successfully lobby for clean air, clean water, and workplace safety, and they felt their own influence rapidly slipping away. They genuinely believed the profit system itself was being insidiously sabotaged by these new structural changes. Which brings us to part two, Powell's strategic blueprint, the counterattack. That deep perception of victimhood is exactly what forged the Powell Memo, authored by corporate lawyer Lewis F. Powell Jr. for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. This wasn't just a letter of complaint. It was a systematic, literal architectural blueprint for a counterattack. He basically told the business community to stop appeasing their critics and instead mount a permanent, aggressively organized effort. And he identified 4 key pillars of American society to target. First, in academia, he wanted to establish scholars to actively monitor textbooks. Second, for the media, he proposed constant surveillance to counter what he saw as liberal bias. Third, in the judiciary, he saw the courts as a vital instrument for social change. And fourth, in politics, he called for aggregating corporate resources to completely reestablish a dominant lobbying presence. And he was crystal clear about the timeline here. Powell wrote, "Strength lies in organization, consistency of action over an indefinite period of years." He was absolutely not calling for a quick, temporary PR campaign to fix a few bad headlines. No, he was calling for a multi-decade, highly funded joint effort to fundamentally alter the intellectual and political landscape of the United States. Okay, part 3, the corporate mobilization. Let's look at the execution and the data.
So, did the business community actually listen to him? Well, the data shows a rapid and undeniable execution of Powell's strategic vision. Just consider this number, 1,262. In 1974, there were only 89 registered corporate political action committees, or PACs, just 89. But by 1980, that number had absolutely exploded to 1,262. This massive influx of infrastructure and capital allowed corporations to completely overwhelm the financing of labor unions and public interest groups.
The execution was immediate, and it was overwhelming. In just a few short years, the number of firms with registered lobbyists jumped from 175 to 2,500. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce went from having pretty minimal political spending to becoming the leading national spender. It was a complete top-to-bottom shift from a fragmented, uncoordinated presence into a highly sophisticated, unified lobbying force that completely transformed how Washington, D.C. operated. They also built this incredible intellectual architecture to essentially surround Washington. The Business Roundtable was formed, merging the CEOs of the top Fortune 200 companies, which turned political engagement into a literal profit center. Then think tanks like the Heritage Foundation and the Cato Institute were founded and funded specifically to provide academic legitimacy to pro-business policies. And over in the media sphere, groups like Accuracy in Media relentlessly pushed the narrative of a liberal media bias. That effort actually helped lead to the deregulation of the airwaves and the eventual end of the fairness doctrine. Moving right along to part 4, reshaping the courts, the judicial pivot. So arguably the most profound impact of this entire mobilization happened in the judiciary. And guys, here's where the story takes an incredible turn. Just months after writing his blueprint on how to use the courts for corporate advantage, Lewis Powell was actually nominated to the Supreme Court by Richard Nixon. That put him in the exact position needed to implement his own vision. To understand his impact on the bench, we really have to talk about the concept of corporate personhood. This is the legal framework asserting that a corporation, as an entity, is entitled to specific rights and protections under the U.S. Constitution, much like a human citizen. Through his rulings, Powell helped redefine the corporation, not just as a business entity serving the public, but as an entity with protected fundamental constitutional rights. Let's trace how this legal evolution actually played out. In the 1978 Bellotti case, Powell authored the majority opinion establishing First Amendment free speech rights for corporations, which allowed them to spend money to influence public referenda. He argued that corporate expression actively assists societal interests. Now, this logically the direct ideological groundwork for the famous 2010 Citizens United decision, which, as you might know, allowed for unlimited corporate spending in elections. Powell essentially shifted the marketplace of ideas into a space heavily dominated by concentrated capital. And the ripple effects of this judicial and political shift, they're massive. Critics point out that sweeping public interest legislation, especially regarding things like climate policy, has largely stagnated. We've seen a huge rise in compulsory arbitration, which limits consumer rights in court. Activist Ralph Nader argues this has actually created a corporate state, or what he calls an inverted totalitarianism, where democratic institutions exist in name, sure, but their substance is completely controlled by corporate interests, right down to the direct marketing targeting children in their own homes. Finally, part 5, blueprint or structural shift, the academic debate. Now, as clear-cut as this narrative might seem, historians and economists ask a very important question. Was the Powell Memo really the sole cause of this massive institutional realignment? This brings us to a fascinating comparison: intentional blueprinting versus structural economic change. One side argues that the precise execution of the memo's specific recommendations, like the explosion of the Chamber of Commerce and the rise of all those conservative think tanks, proves it was a deliberate, intentional blueprint. But the other side counters that larger macro forces were actually at play here. Things like digitization, globalization, and the crippling inflation of the 1970s. They argue the memo was really just elites trying to navigate a structural transformation that was already happening anyway. So what's the big takeaway here? Regardless of whether you view the Powell Memo as the decisive spark that started it all or just a reflection of its time, its enduring legacy is totally undeniable. The institutional framework that was established in the 1970s, the think tanks, the legal foundations, the highly organized lobbying apparatus, that framework remains the absolute dominant engine of American political life today. Which leaves us with this really profound question to ponder. Is the corporate political power we see today the result of a deliberate, carefully executed master plan, or is it simply the natural evolution of a complex global market? Understanding the Powell Memo gives you the context to look at our modern world and decide that for yourself. I hope this explainer gave you a brand new lens to view how our systems are shaped. Keep asking questions and keep exploring.